Deserts boast the most arid habitats on our planet. Few animals can adjust to these conditions. Humans have learned to live in such difficult circumstances over the millennia, and at times, nature lent a peculiar helping hand. Suakin was once one of Sudan's most important ports, but the old town is now entirely deserted. The ruins, however, reveal their strange origins. Houses were built from the skeletons of animals living nearby. But where do so many animals live in such a deserted place? Studying the wildlife of coral reefs, Charles Darwin was surprised to find such an abundance of species in a fundamentally nutrient-poor area. The world of reefs still hides many secrets. Two Hungarian divers, cameraman Zsolt Sásdi and nature photographer Dániel Selmeczi, decided to visit one of the richest marine habitats on Earth, the coral reefs of the western Red Sea coast. On their journey, they came across abandoned shipwrecks and sharp-toothed sharks. At the favourite sites of the pioneers of scuba diving, Hass and Jacques-Yves Cousteau, they looked for an answer to Darwin's question: in what way do millions of the reef's inhabitants depend on each other? The depopulation of Suakin was a consequence of the dynamic development of the city of Port Sudan. Today it's the largest seaport in the region. One couldn't find a better place to prepare for a sea expedition. Captain Ibrahim Saad and Zsolt Sásdi are going to the market to get food and drinks for the weeks-long journey. In the bustling bazaar, anything can be found. If one doesn't like new products, repair is always an option. No mobile phone is too damaged to be revived. Butchers sell beef, goat and camel meat, but grilled lamb is undoubtedly the most popular food here. On the fish market, there's plenty of ray and shark meat. Some are from protected reefs. Sellers are understandably not too happy to see a camera around. They move on to get their provisions. They'll be entirely self-reliant at sea. Luckily, Ibrahim knows the market manager, so they get the best bargains. Once they have every ingredient, they return to the port, where every passerby seems to help the crew to pack and embark. They also stock up on drinking water. The supplies hardly fit into the inflatable boat. It takes several rounds before everything makes its way onto the ship. Dániel Selmeczi is making preparations aboard. As an experienced underwater photographer, he knows too well the smallest mistake during assembly can lead to leakage. Port Sudan has always been a mecca for divers. Rusty or new dive boats seem tiny next to the gigantic cargo and tanker ships. Fishermen seem immune to the port's hustle and bustle. Once everything is on board, the Andromeda lifts anchor and finally leaves the teeming port city behind. In the coming weeks, they will visit Sudan's most famous coral reefs. If all goes to plan, they will sail to the border with Eritrea and film on reefs where nobody has dived before. The first stop, though, is a much better known place, and it's not even a natural reef. A little more than 30 kilometers from Port Sudan lies one of the most spectacular diving sites of the Red Sea. Donnie and Zsolt meticulously check their equipment. The dive promises to be exciting enough in itself. Sailing under the Italian flag, the Umbria was sunk by its own captain at the beginning of World War II because he didn't want the ship and its cargo to end up in the hands of the British. En route to Eritrea, the cargo ship was just being inspected by the Royal Navy when the captain heard on the radio that Italy had declared war on England. He knew that its valuable cargo would be immediately confiscated, so he planned the sabotage for the same night. The ship had not sunk too deep, but raising it was deemed extremely dangerous, so the Brits abandoned it. Divers venturing into the hull can see for themselves why the Brits abandoned the ship so hastily, and why nobody would touch it with a barge pole ever since. The 3 Fiat automobiles probably didn't represent much of a threat to the British fleet, even in their heyday. However, the other hold hides cargo which could have influenced the course of the war. Bombs line the belly of the Umbria, and not just a handful. The ship carried 360,000 bombs, which means more than 5,000 tons of explosives. The British calculated if it exploded, it would have wiped even the distant Port Sudan off the map. Their greatest sadness was that they also had to leave thousands of bottles of wine to decay in the adjacent hold. The divers are getting deeper and deeper into the wreck, hoping to find other curiosities. Finally, in the kitchen they find what they've come for. The pizza ovens are still in a surprisingly good condition. The Umbria has been at the bottom of the sea for over 75 years. As an artificial reef, she gives refuge to numerous animals. Divers can only spend 1 to 2 hours under the water. For them, a shipwreck is a rather dangerous place, even without bombs. From the perspective of marine animals, the desperate Italian captain made a favourable decision. Corals settled on the shipwreck. In a few hundred years, perhaps nothing will distinguish it from a natural coral reef. But why are corals so successful? How can they populate seemingly lifeless waters and create one of the Earth's richest ecosystems? Coral colonies are made up of numerous coral polyps. These small animals filter tiny creatures out of the seawater with the help of tentacles around their orifices. They build a calcic frame. Coral reefs are made of this. In their organism, photosynthesizing algae live and provide their hosts with valuable nutrients. So corals concentrate floating nutrients, and thanks to their algae, additional organic materials get into the sea. Algae produce organic materials by using solar energy, just like trees in a forest. But light behaves differently underwater than in the air. Right under the water's surface, we still see colours the same way as on land. But as we descend deeper and deeper, the water begins to gradually absorb light rays, depending on their colours. First red disappears, then yellow and green. Blue rays go the deepest. Algae cohabiting with the corals have adapted to these circumstances. After all, it's algae which make it possible for their hosts to create reefs, which are gigantic even on a human scale. In exchange, corals not only provide nutrients to the algae, but protection too. These cnidocytes at the end of their tentacles produce venom, and a rather effective one. Touching a fire coral causes terrible pain to humans as well. However, there are things against which corals cannot protect themselves. Rising temperatures put them under such a strain that they expel the algae. Corals whiten as a consequence, and they perish in time. In the warming waters, hostile algae proliferate. Despite their fragility, coral reefs sustain an incredibly complex world, providing a home to very strange creatures. Although the humphead parrotfish feed on corals, they do not endanger the reef. On the contrary, their excrement contributes to delivering nutrients to all parts of the reef. And it even creates sandy beaches. The situation is different with the crown-of-thorns starfish. In warming waters, it reproduces faster. Its natural enemy, the Triton's trumpet snail, is almost entirely wiped out. Thus, the crown-of-thorns is a real threat to the reefs. It increasingly damages the Great Coral Reef in Australia, as well as those in the Red Sea. It practically trims their surface with its tiny tubular feet. In this bustle, everybody is at the table and on the table. Even predators have to protect themselves because an even bigger predator can show up at any time. The lionfish was named after its venomous spiny dorsal fins. The blue-spotted ribbon-tailed ray also possesses an effective weapon, but it rarely uses its venomous tail spine. It prefers to flee. The black-sided hawkfish continuously monitors the sea to avoid surprises. Others don't leave anything to chance. They blend in with their surroundings so well that they're unrecognizable from a distance. Some fish have become the grand masters of camouflage, either to confuse their prey or in order not to become one. This scrawled filefish is a real omnivore. It eats pretty much anything that fits into its mouth, even fire corals. It also makes sure that nobody wants to eat it. The spots on its sides confuse predators, and it can even change their patterns and color on a whim, just like octopuses. Among the reef's inhabitants, relationships can be more complex than between predator and prey. As we've seen with corals and algae, they can also cooperate in a mutually beneficial way. The cleaner fish don't have to be afraid of being eaten by the bigger fish. They clean their parasites, so they enjoy full protection. Of course, there are some who take advantage of the situation. They pose as cleaner fish, maybe even clean a bit, but abuse the confidence of their clients by biting bits and pieces off them. There are crustaceans which offer similar services, but sometimes they go a bit too far. Each inhabitant of the coral reef has its place in the ecosystem. This is so even if there's no escape from certain predators. There are otherwise mobile animals which won't hide from predators. Instead, they form a shoal as the predator misses its prey more easily in a crowd. Bluefin trevallies maraud along the reef. The smaller fish leave in panic. After splitting the shoal, catching the prey seems to become much easier. Sometimes it's the predators which form groups. This crowd of barracudas shows that infinite quantities of nutrients are available. The Andromeda is taking a southerly direction. The plan is to photograph the biggest predator of Sudan's waters. Hammerhead sharks live in deeper waters and only rarely swim near the surface. One needs quite a bit of luck to meet one. Careful planning and knowledge of the reefs are also indispensable. At the appropriate place, the crew anchors the ship within minutes. If everything goes well, Zsolt and Donny will spend the next few days filming sharks. The divers can only spend a limited amount of time in deeper waters, so everything has to work perfectly if they are to film sharks. They swim towards the dark depths straight away, but only encounter smaller grey reef sharks. But soon enough, the first hammerhead shark appears. The scalloped hammerhead is never alone during the day. A bigger swarm ought to be somewhere below. Before long, the others show up. It seems they've found the best diving spot. A scout leaves the group to examine the newcomers. The sharks aren't bothered by the presence of divers. Soon the whole group is passing in front of the camera. The eyes of the sharks sit at the edge of their hammer-like heads. The 360-degree field of vision makes them very effective predators. They form swarms only during the day. At night, they scatter and hunt alone. The sharks swim past slowly. The divers can't follow them because from this depth, a lengthy decompression stop would have to precede the ascent. After returning to the reef, they have time to look around in these shallower waters. At the reef's wall, the corpse of a white-tip reef shark is hanging from a hook. It seems that fishermen don't spare protected predators around here either. White-tips mostly dwell in rock cavities where they're protected against bigger sharks and can always have a rest after hunting. Coral reefs often have steep walls reaching to hundreds of meters of depth. In shallow waters, these walls have numerous crevices and cavities which provide animals with secure hiding places. If they feel threatened, the fish that hide here immediately fight back against intruders. Zsolt probably disturbed the territory of a smaller shark. While sharks rarely attack divers, the cornered animal probably felt that it had no choice but to defend itself. Luckily, the crew had a doctor who could attend to the wound immediately. Zsolt can't dive for weeks. To make use of his forced rest, he decided to find out more about the threat humans pose to sharks after his own close encounter with them. Dubai is the world's most dynamically developing city. It has one of the largest shark aquariums in the world. However, Zsolt hasn't come to see that. He wants to find out how many shark fins end up on one of the biggest fish markets of the Middle East. A startling sight already on arrival. Hundreds of dried fins await him, and the situation is even more depressing inside. One can find the fins of whale sharks, the world's biggest fish close to extinction, as well as the hastily removed body parts of smaller sharks. According to UN estimates, more than 400,000 tons of sharks are fished every year. European countries also take part in the killing. The excessive shark fin trade has pushed hammerhead sharks to the brink of extinction too. By eradicating apex predators of complex marine ecosystems, the whole habitat might be endangered. While more and more international agreements are signed, fish markets are still full of murdered sharks. Returning to the Red Sea, Zsolt and Donny decide to learn more about the work of Sudanese fishermen close up. The crew of the tiny fishing boat spends days out at sea. They settled in relatively comfortably. As they tell the captain of the Andromeda, they couldn't make a living otherwise, and they always sell their catch on the local market. Their simple methods are harmful, but don't seriously threaten the inhabitants of the reefs. Only large-scale fishing by bigger fishing boats has a globally detrimental effect. For Sudanese fishermen, this is the only possibility to support their families, though this isn't much consolation to the hooked reef shark. As Zsolt's wound is healing nicely, the Andromeda can continue her journey. Its passengers do their utmost to document events. So we'll dive on this blue dot. How far is it? 1.5 hours, I think. Then we leave at dawn. We set off at dawn and we'll be there at 6. It will be a nice place to see hammerheads. And here is Daklat Caben, where there is this shipwreck. We haven't been there before. It's an iron sailing boat. Donny has dived in Sudan for years, so he knows several sites that other divers don't frequent too often. At sunset, frisky guests show up at the ship. Fast-moving silky sharks circle around the stern. In the morning, Zsolt checks every part of the camera. He's just had one accident and wouldn't like to have another catastrophe. The attacker left its tooth marks on the diving suit. Of course, they are aware that this was just an unfortunate accident and sharks don't represent a serious threat to them. The only question is whether the silky sharks circling around the ship agree with this. After jumping in, the animals immediately notice the divers. They seem rather curious. Sometimes it's worth warning them by swinging the fins. One of them almost tastes the camera. And as if this wasn't enough, Donny tries to lure them closer for a photo opportunity. The guys seem to be right. The sharks don't consider them as nourishment. After a while, they even get bored of the chase, so the divers can set off to the coral reef. They're using scooters to be able to visit a much larger area and explore the most untouched parts of the reef. At southern dive sites, unseen amounts of fish await them. More than 1,000 species of fish live in the Red Sea, and one can meet most of them here. But how do animals populate reefs in such high numbers? How do they choose their mates? How do they reproduce? And how do they raise their offspring? Every species follows a different strategy. Some come up with ingenious solutions. Big-eyed trevallies break off from the main group with their pairs for spawning. The one swimming below turns black and signals its readiness to spawn by turning sideways. The female clownfish lives with several males, but only spawns with one of them. When they perish, the dominant male switches its sex and chooses a new male pair for mating. Goliath groupers can also change their sex, but they switch from female to male. More than a metre-long animals, and such dainty moves for a nuptial dance. One wouldn't expect so much affection from such big fish. But dating can easily degenerate into a quarrel, especially if a third one appears on the scene. There are fish whose spawning lacks any romance. White-tip reef shark males mate in groups with a single female. She appears to be the victim here, but in fact she chooses the one she mates with in the end. The white-tip reef shark is a viviparous species. The gestation period lasts a good year. One instance of parthenogenesis is known, when a white-tip had an offspring without mating. This happened in the Nyíregyháza Zoo in Hungary. Donnie and Zsolt notice a few young reef sharks. They follow them to deeper waters where they find a cave. When they swim close by, it becomes evident that it's a shark kindergarten, a hideout for young sharks. In the spacious place, sharks don't feel cornered, so by looking around in their home, Zsolt is not risking the good looks of his diving suit again. Further away, another fish with rather strong jaws is getting ready for child rearing. The triggerfish can bite through the hardest corals, and this is advantageous not just during nutrition. When they feel the pressing need to start a family, they turn the seabed into a minefield. They build nests on the sandy seabed next to the reef. They carefully rearrange the coral pieces lying on the seabed and then dig a hole into the sand by vibrating their bodies. Finer operations are done by spouting water from their mouths. They protect their spawn, which develop in these nests rather aggressively, but sometimes the frightening teeth are not enough. Resolute bluefin trevallies attack the nests. The triggerfish fight back persistently but are overpowered eventually, and the attackers ravenously devour the spawn. We can demonstrate by a simple experiment how fiercely triggerfish protect their territory. If, of course, setting up a huge mirror covered with safety film can be called simple at the bottom of the sea. This lone triggerfish is patrolling around its nest without suspecting anything. Then suddenly it notices something. It seems that our hero is trying to chase away everything that moves, even its own mirror image. Of course, after a while it gives up the fight and looks for other fish to chase away. Pufferfish move around rather clumsily thanks to their bodily composition, so somehow they have to protect themselves against predators. Most of their species are strongly venomous. If that wasn't enough, they can pump so much water into their stomachs that they become like a ball. Covered with sharp spikes, no attacker wants to swallow them. The blue-tailed trunkfish is probably the oddest-looking inhabitant of the Red Sea. The little ones of many reef species look entirely different from their parents. These black and white fish will change completely as time goes by. Looking at the adults, it's as if they belong to a different species. The emperor angelfish also transform as they grow up. The spawn of these stripy yellow and blue animals have completely different patterns. According to some explanations, this helps them confuse predators. Sea currents play an extraordinary role in the nutrition of coral reefs. The water is in constant motion, so nourishment reaches animals which don't live directly on the surface of the reef. For instance, the 5-meter-long manta ray feeds exclusively on tiny planktonic animals. Bigger groups of fish use the currents to move from reef to reef, which connects distant coral reefs into a huge single habitat. For divers, however, these currents can be particularly dangerous. One of the assistant divers hasn't returned to the ship. Luckily, he has a radio and a GPS on him, so he can report his position. Many divers have been swept away by currents. Several were never found.
You see the boy of the diver? Okay, we go there.
Fortunately, the GPS quickly directs the crew to the diver in trouble. He can climb into the rescue boat in less than 20 minutes. Gamal was lucky. He will probably pay more attention to keeping up with the group next time. The Andromeda continues her journey towards the Eritrean border. These are dangerous waters with tiny islands and unknown reefs, which have caused the ruin of many ships. Donnie and Zsolt decide to have a closer look at the scene of these tragedies. They're taking the boat to find out more about forgotten wrecks. It's not easy to moor the boat on the shallow reef. The island's shoreline is full of spiky corals. There is no chance for survival if one has to land here out of necessity. Nothing is known about the crew of the Berlin yacht. Maybe they had already abandoned ship out on the open waters and then it drifted to the reef. The sailors of another shipwreck did not survive either. The smaller cargo ship has been destroyed beyond recognition by the waves. A name is only legible on a nearby lifeboat, though it's not entirely sure that the boat belonged to the ship. Piles of stones on this uninhabited island mark the graves of the shipwrecked sailors. Without outside help, the sailors had no chance to survive. The air temperature is above 40 degrees Celsius, and there is no fresh water on the island. Even brown boobies, which nest here, hardly get by, though they've got used to the harsh environment. But it's worth nesting here, as no predator threatens the nestlings. We may think we're at the end of the world, but the litter on shore reminds us of the proximity of civilization. Just as Zsolt and Donnie return to the ship, a sandstorm arrives from the shore. The Andromeda takes a northerly direction, leaving behind the desolate southern reefs. They are back on course to Port Sudan. As if they sense the joy of the crew, dolphins escort the ship cheerily for long miles. The Andromeda passes another shipwreck. Ibrahim navigates the ship closer. Now it becomes clear that this huge stranded cargo ship has already been dismantled. Parts of it may well have been recycled to sail the seas in another ship. In the kitchen, the chef cooks for both the divers and the crew. A long journey awaits. Finally, there's time to rest and catch up. There's always something to do in the engine room. During the journey, the engine worked fine. The Andromeda sails the waves, unstoppable. They're not returning home yet. One of the most beautiful diving sites of the Red Sea awaits them, the Shah Rumi Reef, which became world famous thanks to Captain Cousteau. The lagoon is enclosed by a coral reef. Entry is through a passage blasted by Cousteau. Though he did have a penchant for explosives, the pioneer of scuba diving wasn't motivated by causing destruction. He was conducting a large-scale experiment to find out whether humans can live under the sea for a longer period of time. He couldn't have found a better place for the undertaking. He could be sure that the participants in his experiment wouldn't be bored for a minute. One of the last stops of the expedition promises to be quite a spectacle. Shah Rumi is famous for its sizable grey reef sharks, among other things. The reef, exposed to strong currents, hosts an incredible number of animals. Watching the floating, colourful fish it's hard to imagine a more peaceful location. But the abundance attracts the biggest predators as well. The huge barracuda looks at the divers with interest as Donnie tries to get a close-up. He tries all his tricks until the curious animal looks directly into his lens from nearby. Suddenly, marauding grey reef sharks arrive. These fast-moving animals spend their days in deeper waters. But if they hear something that's happening on the reef through vibrations carried by the water, they get there in a flash. Divers are not considered food. If the sharks are not provoked, they can be photographed from up close. Cousteau's divers made observations from cages. The old shark cages still lie at the same spot where they were left. But these are not the only mementos of the adventurous experiment. At the upper part of the reef, a dome covered by corals stands as a reminder of Cousteau's underwater base. The precontinent too stood here more than 50 years ago. The several-story station was removed, but the submarine garage and the storage structures for scooters can be found on the seabed to this day. Only at night can one feel how it must have felt to spend long weeks underwater. Divers living here were the guinea pigs. The effects of prolonged underwater living on their bodies were closely monitored. Jacques Cousteau's dreams never materialized. People still haven't moved under the sea. The remnants of his research base are monuments to a daring idea which, in the 1960s, appeared entirely realistic. Nevertheless, the experiment yielded useful results. This was the first time the nocturnal life of coral reefs was thoroughly observed. Under the veil of darkness, creatures show up which would be difficult to photograph by day. The fundamental rules, of course, don't change. Eat or be eaten. Marauding rays cover a huge area looking for food. Fish that are active during the day try to make it through the night by hiding under the corals. Parrotfish don't settle for a nice hiding place. They secrete mucus from their mouth to cover their whole body, forming a cocoon to deter anyone from surprising them in their sleep. There are some who eat continuously, and there are those who are able to fight anybody. Lionfish grab their prey with a sudden movement. Sharks also like the element of surprise. With their electric sensing organs, they're able to identify their victims, so they know very well that it's not worth biting into either the camera or the cameraman. One of the most interesting phenomena of the nighttime reef can only be made visible to humans with a little help. Lit by a special blue light, some of the animals emit a fluorescent light. By watching this through a yellow filter, we only see the emitted light. Nocturnal fish see something similar in the water. Scientists have only recently started examining the so-called biofluorescence. This typically serves as a communication tool, and it may play a role in mating as well as in hiding. Red and pink varieties also exist, but in the shallows, the yellow-green color is the most frequent type. The captain of the Andromeda tries to prove to his crew that he's also the skipper on the football pitch. On the final evenings, sitting around a water pipe, Donnie and Zsolt sum up their experiences. Flipping through the identification guide, they take notes of all the species they've seen. In the end, they can tick off the whole book. It turns out that one of them has seen species that the other hasn't even noticed, but they want to see them all. They have no choice but to agree to return again soon to the Red Sea. Before going home, they visit the most spectacular and, according to many, the only atoll of the Red Sea, the strictly protected Sanganeb coral reef. The highest lighthouse of the region can be found here, with a view of the whole reef from the top. They couldn't have found a better place to say goodbye to the sea. The lighthouse provides security not only for sailors. At its feet lies Sudan's first national park, and in the eyes of many, this has made the lighthouse the symbol of protecting coral reefs. In the sweltering heat, it's not very pleasant to climb up the winding stairs, but the sight amply compensates for the effort. Or at least, this is the hope. Donnie and Zsolt have quite a journey behind them. They visited the most beautiful diving sites of the Red Sea and experienced firsthand the infinite variety of the underwater wilderness. They also witnessed the perishing of coral reefs and the systematic killing of sharks. These processes threaten one of the Earth's richest but perhaps most vulnerable ecosystems. A big part of the Great Coral Reef in Australia has recently been entirely destroyed. If other marine habitats end up with the same fate, this will have unforeseeable consequences for humanity.